This is crazy. I still can't wrap my mind around this. I'm gonna explain what's going on and why I'm so excited about this. So, for starters, one, this is not a sponsored video in any way, shape, or form. I bought this with my own money. I've waited months to buy this. And two, I am not a gear review expert. This is not some gear review channel. I have science videos and I have photography videos because those are the two most important hobbies or things that I do for enjoyment in my life. And this fits into one of those. So, this is the new Canon RF 14 to 35 millimeter lens. It's an f4 lens, and no matter how hard you might try, you cannot get this lens anywhere. It is currently back ordered with Canon. I called them 2 days ago and they had no estimate for when back orders would be filled. And I had the extreme luck of calling my local camera store to ask if they had any of these. It only was released about a week ago. And when I called, they answered and they said, yes, we have one of them. And it hadn't even been put into their inventory yet. If it had, someone would have bought it immediately off of their website. But since it wasn't in their inventory, I was able to drive to the store and buy what I think is the only copy of this lens in the entire state of Hawaii. So, since I am in this really fortunate position to have this incredible lens that I have waited months for and that I have sold other lenses to be able to afford, I thought I would do kind of a simple everyday person review of this lens. So, let's get to it. So let's ditch the box because you know I haven't left it in this over the past day. Here it is in all its glory. Focus camera, there we go. This is the 14 to 35. And this so far has been an amazing experience to shoot in. We're gonna get into the images in just a moment. But for starters, you have your control ring right out here in the front. I use this for setting ISO. You have a focus ring here, no stops, of course. And then you have your zoom ring right here. You'll notice the barrel does extend about 1 centimeter in total, and that extension is minimized when you're sitting at about 20 to 24 millimeters. This is not my first L lens, but this absolutely feels like all of my EF L lenses. This is a solid piece of kit, even though it has a mostly plastic body. On my EOS R, it feels phenomenal. This is my first RF lens, so I no longer have to use the adapter. It no longer feels front heavy like it did when I used that adapter with my other glass. And overall, I mean, this thing is just girthy and it feels awesome in the hand. It really does feel balanced on the EOS R, as I'm sure it does on the R5 or R6. So let's get into the images that you get with this thing. And I'm gonna start off with talking about what I think is probably the biggest problem or con with this lens. The good news is I do think it's gonna be temporary. The bad news is it's a pretty big one. So I have this first image up on the screen because frankly, it illustrates what I consider to be a fatal flaw in this lens for the time being. And that's a really important caveat. This image was taken at 14 millimeters, and as you can see, it has extreme amounts of vignetting in the corners. I have not cropped this or added any sort of vignetting to the image. Really, even though you're paying for a 14 to 35 millimeter lens, this is really a 16 to 35 millimeter lens if you don't want to deal with that vignetting in the corners. And the reason why that vignetting exists is because for the moment, there is no profile to correct it in software like Adobe Lightroom, which is what I use to edit my photos. That said, there is a workaround for the near term until we get those profiles. So, as you can see in this next image, we also have extreme corner vignetting, what I would call unusable. But if I apply a profile for the Canon RF 24 to 70 f4.1 to 7.1, this is what you get. Now, the horizon looks a little wonky in some places. The distortion correction isn't perfect, but overall, this is a much, much better image, and I would call this a usable image. This isn't even a profile that I built myself or developed or customized for the lens. This is just slapping another profile on. So overall, I would say, while this lens does have a major flaw right off the bat, it is correctable, and in the future when Canon makes that profile available to Adobe or when Adobe develops their own, that is not going to be a problem anymore at all. So the next thing that I really like about this lens is its focal range. As I mentioned before, I had a Canon EF 24 to 70, and I always found myself hanging out at that 24mm end of the range and always wanting a little bit more, wanting just a little bit more of a scene in my photos. photos. And this lens has more than fit the bill in enabling me to do that. So up on the screen right now, I'm gonna throw up an image. This image was taken at 14 millimeters. Of course, I have not corrected that vignetting in the corners like we talked about. This image was taken at 20 millimeters, 24 millimeters, and finally 35 millimeters. For me personally, those are different images. The first image at 14 millimeters really is a completely different image. It captures the surfer on the side, but it also accentuates the leading lines of the breakwater. Compare that to the image at 35 millimeters, and it's really much more about that couple out there at the end of the breakwater and the sunset as a whole. So if you're a person like me who likes to live a little bit more at the ultra wide angle side of things in terms of your focal lengths and what you tend to prefer, if you always want a little bit more of a scene, but you also like being able to pull it in and stay close enough for a portrait, I personally think that this is going to be a perfect lens for you that you're going to be really, really happy with. I know that a lens like this is a good fit for me when I find myself naturally using the entire focal range, all the way from 14 millimeters to 35 millimeters. This is an image that I took at 14 millimeters to accentuate the leading lines and really the structure and the textures of the breakwater, all those little pock marks in the concrete. This image was taken closer to 20 millimeters of capoeira dancers. I was kneeling down next to a bench and I just wanted to stay out of the way, right? But I still wanted that wide angle feel. This image was taken closer to 35 millimeters because I wanted to test out how the bokeh was on this lens. Yeah, it's basically non-existent, at least in this setting. The background's a little nervous, but I didn't buy this lens to shoot f2 or f1.8 portraits. I am perfectly happy with these results for an ultra wide angle lens that can still shoot at 35 millimeters. And of course, on this lens, you can always get super close and open the lens up all the way out to the 14 millimeter range. That is actually one of my favorite things about this lens, is the insane close focusing distance. It's something like 2 inches in front of the lens, so close that you actually think you're going to bump the lens into things. So if you're someone who likes to get really close to things, you can do that. Get close and then get even closer, because this lens can handle it. In this photo back out on Waikiki, this is actually a puddle in the bottom of a drinking fountain. The lens literally was just right up against the edge of the water, and it performed flawlessly for the image that I intended. Now, just a moment ago, I talked about blurring your backgrounds and bokeh and why this is not a prime lens and you should not expect prime lens levels of bokeh from this lens. That said, it really does perform quite well when you bring things closer towards kind of the close focus limit. These flowers here, this photo was taken at 20 millimeters, and the background to my eye is pretty pleasing. It's pretty darn smooth. Even closer at 35 millimeters, same edge of the close focusing distance, and the background is just buttery smooth. I would be super happy with this, and while sure, you're not going to have someone's face 2 inches away from the lens, if you're looking to take semi-macro photos or small-scale environmental portraits, you are going to love this thing. So I know I've been gushing about this lens, and I promise I'm almost done. There is one more thing that I want to say, and it is probably, for me, the thing that made this lens worth every single penny. Because when I saw videos from Adorama and a few other places on YouTube, I did not believe those review videos because they get their lenses for free from Canon to review. They didn't have any skin in the game. I paid for this lens. I traded in and sold my other lens to be able to afford this. And so I can tell you that I'm being 100% honest with you, and I am just blown away by the image stabilization on this lens. 5 or 5.5 stops of image stabilization, that is just a number. So let me show you what you can actually do with it on a body like this, the EOS R, that does not have in-body image stabilization. If you have a body that does, you get 7 stops of image stabilization. So what does that actually mean in the field? Well, I'm gonna pull this image up. This image was taken handheld out on the breakwater at Waikiki. It's not a beautiful image. I took it specifically to show you what a handheld long exposure looks like with this lens. This is a half-second handheld long exposure. And if we zoom way in here, you can literally see the individual cracks in the rocks on this rock facade, and we get a beautiful texture in the water from that half-second exposure. I love taking long exposures, and I always have to carry my tripod with me to do it. And for once, I have a lens that is going to let me take short, long exposures, handheld, and still get sharp images out of it. This blew my mind. But there's one more image. This is an ultra wide image. This is somewhere around, I think, the 17mm range in terms of focal length. And this is just of a little waterfall here on campus. Again, compositionally, garbage. I didn't take this to be a nice photo. I took this to show you what this lens can do. If you zoom in, way in, on the moss on this rock, you can see incredible detail. This is not a half-second long exposure. This image is a 1 second handheld long exposure. And we're not talking about squatting and having your elbows on your knees or anything like that. I literally was just hunched over sideways to take this photo. And for me, the fact that it is this sharp blows my mind. And it really is this image that sold me on this lens, because I carry my tripod all the time to be able to do long exposures, whether that's of portrait clients when they're in the water, in the waves, to get a little bit more motion in those waves, or whether it's out for landscapes, going on a hike to just get a little bit of blur in the clouds or something like that, or even just a stream. The idea that I can take a half or 1 second or maybe even 1.5 second long exposure and get an image that is this sharp, because this image has no business being this sharp, handheld at 1 second, that blew my mind. And it convinced me that yes, this is the perfect lens for me to carry not only for travel and hiking, but also to take along on portraiture shoots for some of those more creative photos that I try to take every now and then. If you have a body that has in-body image stabilization, I expect you will get even better results. And frankly, I would love to see some of the things that people are going to do with this lens with those more expensive bodies. So I'm gonna wrap up this video. I have gushed about this lens plenty. And yes, it has its problems. This really, at the moment, is not a 14-35. This is a 16-35 or something like that. And it is a damn expensive 16-35 at that. That said, this lens has blown my mind, and it is worth every single penny. As someone who works really hard for every single penny that I have, and the last time that I bought a lens like this was about 8 years ago. So I can tell you, in those 8 years, this is by far the best investment I have made in my photography. I cannot wait to take it out. I cannot wait to shoot from 14 all the way out to 35. I cannot wait to see what this image stabilization can do in more creative settings than just here around campus or down around Waikiki. And if you are someone like me who tends towards the wider focal lengths, I really cannot recommend this lens enough. Go out and try to find one. And I will say, if you are trying to find one, look in your local camera store. One, because it's good to support local business, but two, if it's anything like what I've experienced, Amazon was telling me it was going to be upwards of 2 months on how badly these were backordered. Canon had no information on when I would be able to get a lens if I ordered it from them. And yet, my local store had one. Did I get lucky? Yes. But chances are some of you out there might get lucky as well and get to work with this incredible piece of kit. So if you have any questions or you want me to make a follow-up video, please put comments down below. I am happy to answer them there or in a follow-up video. And if you enjoyed this video, I know it was a lot of gushing, and this is not a gear review channel, although I have some photography videos up now. If you enjoyed this video, please remember to like and subscribe. It helps out and it lets me know that someone out there in the world is actually watching these things. Either way, I'm actually going to go put on my camera strap, take this guy outside, and keep shooting. Hope you guys have a good one, and I'll see you next time.